Welcome everyone, welcome to the 2021 Liberty Victoria AGM. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on, the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today. I also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that you are all located on, from around Australia or around Victoria. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that this will always be and always was Aboriginal land. It's been a very busy 2021 as President of Liberty Victoria this year. It's been a challenging year and a rewarding year. It's a cliche to say that the last 18 months or so have been unprecedented. I think that we're all sick and tired of hearing people say that, but it has been the reality. The pandemic has thrown up pretty complex issues as they pertain to human rights and civil liberties over the past 18 months. And Liberty Victoria has been very active in that space. We've had restrictions over the last 18 months that many of us couldn't have imagined back in 2019. And in respect of those restrictions and issues that have arisen, we've spoken out about those in different ways. It's been probably our busiest year in terms of media appearances. We've had, at last count, over 80 media appearances since the beginning of the pandemic. We have been very lucky to have a media team that's made up of Tom Clark, Adam Pulford, and members of the committee who have spent a lot of time in helping do those appearances and speaking out about issues. And I just want to single them out as a big thank you for all the help that everyone's given in respect of that. So the media team is Greg Hansen, Gemma Caffarella, Martin Rajak, Michael Stanton, Tim Warner, Greg Buckhorn, Sam Norton, Hannah Dickinson, Jamie Gardner, Tom Clark, and Adam Pulford. So thank you very much to everyone in that team. I think that it's been a lot of hard work, but a lot of good work that has been done in that space. We've spoken out on a number of issues over the last year as it relates to the pandemic. So that's included privacy issues about QR codes and contact tracing. We've talked about the return to peaceful protest. We've also talked about removing restrictions on Australian citizens and permanent residents returning home, and even Victorians being able to return home to Victoria from New South Wales earlier this year. And we've also discussed the over-reliance on policing to manage the pandemic, which has disproportionately affected more vulnerable people. We've made a number of submissions to different parliamentary inquiries, federal and state, as well as law reform commissions. So we've made submissions that were about COVID-19, extremism, justice law reform, immigration, asylum seeker and refugee issues. And thank you to everyone on the policy committees who have given their time to work on those submissions, and our volunteers as well. RAP has continued its great work. RAP has continued to reach out to younger members to do work that's really at the forefront of some of the law reform, and there have been 2 excellent reports already published and more excellent reports that we're looking forward to. The issues that RAP has been advocating on include bail law reform and about visa blind spots as well. Emma Buckley-Lennox, I'm not sure if she's signed in today, but Emma has been the chair of RAP for a number of years and her work has just been phenomenal. She is now in Alice Springs doing work there. And so she left us as RAP chair, but I just wanted to acknowledge all the work that she has done. It's been instrumental to the work, to the success of RAP and the success of Liberty Victoria as well. Rochelle has had the torch passed on to her by Emma, and Rochelle's been continuing that excellent work, and we're really looking forward to seeing everything else that RAP does over the next few years. We had our Voltaire Human Rights Awards this year, which were a great success. They were held online again because of the pandemic, but it was a really good event, and if you haven't had an opportunity to watch it yet, you can watch it on YouTube or through the website. The recipients this year were the children of Tanya Day for the Voltaire Human Rights Award, Mohammed Semra for the Young Voltaire Human Rights Award, and the Empty Chair Award this year went to all refugees and asylum seekers in on and offshore detention. Because of COVID-19, we've now had 2 years where we've had to cancel our annual Voltaire Human Rights Award dinner, which has thrown up some financial difficulties, but we have been vigilant to ensure that we have long-term financial sustainability, and Michelle will talk a little bit more about how the finance are doing things like that. But we have been working very hard to ensure that we're sustainable in the long term. We have some members who are leaving us, not as members, but as committee members this year. And I just wanted to thank them for all of their work over the past few years. So Martin Rajak, who has been our secretary and the chair of our Criminal Justice Working Group. Thank you very much, Martin, for all the work that he's been doing. Sophie Stafford, who was a member of our Criminal Justice Working Group and has been a member of Liberty Victoria Policy Committee for a number of years. So Sophie's also finishing up. And then Kat George, who's been a member of our Privacy Working Group. So thank you very much to all those people for their work, and we hope that they do stay in touch. You can leave Liberty, but it never leaves you. So, and that really brings me to the end of the reflections of 2021. And maybe moving on to the formalities, everyone should have received an agenda which includes the minutes from last year's AGM. So I might just firstly propose that last year's 2020 minutes be approved. And Thomas has his hand up. I think Thomas is seconding it. And unless I hear otherwise from anyone, I think that motion passes. Excellent, thanks very much. And then I'll hand over to Michelle for the financial report. Michelle Bennett.
Thanks, Julia. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I will try and make this quite brief. We have had a solid year financially. Those who've had a look at the report will see our surplus at just under 9,000 is significantly less than prior years, or recent years anyway. That reflects really that we've had a lot of calls on our funds, because the circumstances that we find ourselves in with the pandemic means that there's been a lot of work to be done, and the team have risen to that work, and that required additional expenditure. There's two particular things that have added to that expenditure, which are really important for our longevity. The first is two of our donations this year, two very generous donations from Michael Drapack and Thomas Kane, have been tied to development. So we have created a leadership fund, which is available now to support the development of committee members and members of Liberty who are going to make an ongoing contribution, and to find ways to provide education and develop the skills so that we can better serve our purposes. The other expense that's more significant this year is for RAP, due to their excellent fundraising and some of their really ambitious projects. A RAP officer has been appointed, and so that's been funded for, I think now we've got 9 or 12 months funding in place for that role to help boost the work that RAP's been doing. On the other side of the ledger, whilst we've had a really encouraging upsurge in memberships and membership funds, therefore, we couldn't run our traditional Voltaire Award, as Julia said again, which meant that our overall fundraising was significantly lower this year, which we expected. And so we're really happy to have come out in a relatively strong financial position because of the generosity of donors nonetheless. But it does mean that over the next couple of years, we're really going to have to be focused on fundraising to support the work we're doing to enable some of these initiatives to continue, and so that we really can serve the needs that the pandemic has highlighted are really increasingly important, and how significant the work Liberty is doing is for the Victorian people. I don't think there's anything else I wanted to add other than, as always, to thank our donors and those who have volunteered their time as well to support us and keep us afloat.
Thanks very much, Michelle. I think I then propose a motion that the financial report be approved, and if that can be seconded, and if anybody has any, Julian, I think Burnside is seconding it, and if I don't hear anything contrary, I think that motion passes as well. The next item on the agenda are some constitutional changes. So you should have all received with the notice of the AGM, also notice of a special meeting with some proposed constitutional changes. I'll hand over to Thomas Kane, who will give a brief summary of those changes and explain them. And if there's any questions, he can answer those as well. Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, Julia. This is a subject that we could spend several hours on, or perhaps just a few minutes. Strong preference for the latter. The first thing I want to say is that the reason for updating the Constitution is that during the pandemic, we started meeting in a different way, and this is merely a matter of management and process. But we started, instead of meeting as two main committees, that of management and of policy, but as one larger group. It was an idea put forward by Sam Norton, and it led to a greater efficiency, and on average, half an hour less meeting time a month for everybody, which adds up. So that was the original motivation. And then another matter was raised, and that was of the RAP group wanting to feel more connected to the main work of Liberty Victoria, and identifying that really a two-way flow of information was needed in order that we maximise our efficiency, both as RAP and as Liberty generally. The executive talked about that and thought that really we did have a gap in that RAP wasn't recognised in any formal way at all as being an operational part of Liberty Victoria, and that it indeed deserved that, and we needed to do that. So they were the main reasons. There were a number of mechanical or process reasons as well for making minor changes to how meetings might happen, to when our memberships might expire depending on when we had signed up, and to rule out the inequities of people paying a year's membership and then only getting a couple of months because they signed up in April or May, something like that. So there were a number of small administrative matters that needed to be cleaned up. So we reached out and for a bit of help, and Holding Redlich very kindly agreed to do some pro bono work for us. And having read our Constitution, which really was only about 5 years old since the last revision, told us that it was somewhat old-fashioned and needed to be modernised. So they tell me that we've done that at the same time. And so the main changes in it are the inclusion of RAP formally as a committee of Liberty Victoria, the inclusion of RAP on the general committee of the organisation, and the process changes. We also noticed during the review of it that the office bearers, although given titles, actually hadn't been given any work to do and had no obligation to meet. Well, we fixed that. There are duties described now, and there is an obligation to meet. So we have gone through it carefully. Michael is available to answer technical questions should anybody feel a strong desire to ask them. But I would propose to the meeting that we adopt the changes as put forward to you in your papers.
Thanks, Thomas. Michelle, you've got your hand up. Is that a yes to the motion, or was it a question? Oh, yes to the motion.
Yes to the motion.
Yeah. Is there anyone that has any questions before we vote on the proposed changes? No, there's silence, so I'm going to take that as no questions. So yes, the proposal is that the members present at the AGM adopt the proposed constitutional changes. Michelle, you seconded that. And unless anyone else has anything to say, no, I think that motion passes and those changes will be made.
Thanks, Julia. Could I just also propose that we move a vote of thanks to Emily Booth, Catherine O'Connor and Matthew Goff from Holding Redlich for all of their advice and assistance, particularly as we were a bit slow in responding to them at times. We very much appreciate their work.
Absolutely. Thanks, Thomas. Yes, I second that. And there's some claps going around. So thank you very much to Thomas and Mike as well for their work, and Rochelle in dealing with Holding Redlich and doing these changes and all the work that's gone into that. So thank you very much. And that brings us to the next item on the agenda, which are the elections. There's the elections of the Management Committee and of the Policy Committee, with some of the Policy Committee being co-opted. Because there are no contests, so to speak, between the different positions, I think that I can move that the 2022 Management Committee and Policy Committee, as contained in the minutes, be approved. And I think that we can do that in one vote, so to speak, unless, so if anybody's able to second that motion. James D'Alessandro, and unless we hear anything further, I think I can say that motion passes. So that ends my time as president, and I'm going to hand over to our 2022 or 2021-22 president, Mike Stanton. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Julia. First, I'd like to thank you for all your efforts over the past year as president. Julia has been an inspiring and tireless president of Liberty Victoria, recently acknowledged in Hansard, no less, for her work. And she's had a really vital role in advocating for civil liberties and human rights, and all this during the time of COVID-19. I can't think of a more challenging 12-month period for a president of Liberty Victoria, but Julia has confronted those challenges head on with good humour and has seen Liberty Victoria emerge stronger as a result. And there are simply too many things that Julia has done to list them all now. Perhaps most recently, Julia's work on the proposed pandemic-specific legislation has been incredible. There have been numerous consultations with government, including the crossbenchers, and the drafting of a substantive submission on the bill. Her leadership has seen Liberty placed in a very important role as a trusted voice, one that is truly independent, vigilant and informed when the debate has been incredibly polarised and misinformation has been rife. Our position on in relation to COVID-19 generally has been underpinned by the harm principle, that people should be free to do what they want unless their actions place others at the real risk of significant harm. Invariably, our position has been attacked from across the political spectrum, which probably shows we've been getting the balance just about right. Another great achievement from Julia's time at the helm has been our improved media engagement. Julia has been pivotal in making us more dynamic, able to respond to media requests quickly and to improve our reach. We must thank Tom and Adam for that too. We've had a number of spokespeople who have stepped up over the past year, and Julia has strengthened our depth as an organisation, and I can see the talent that we have, and it's very inspiring. I'd like to acknowledge Michelle and Thomas for working so hard to strengthen our financial position during such a difficult time when we haven't been able to hold events as we usually would. It's also fitting that this year, with Julia as president, we formally include the Rights Advocacy Project in our constitution. Julia participated in that program, formerly Young Liberty for Law Reform, and our partnership with RAP has seen our organisation modernise and appeal to a whole new generation of civil liberties and human rights advocates. And I'd like to acknowledge the leadership of RAP over the years, including Louise Brown, Lucy Maxwell and Gemma Lee Dodds, Kat Brown, Emma Buckley-Lennox, and now Rochelle Francis. And it's wonderful that RAP rightly now has a place in our constitution. I'd like to speak briefly about the challenges ahead. We have two elections on the horizon, a federal election to be held on or before the 21st of May 2022, and a state election to be held on the 26th of November 2022. The first point that I'd like to make is that in Victoria, it is highly likely that we will see another law and order auction election. It's disappointing that given the chorus of calls to amend bail and mandatory sentencing laws, there are reports that the Labor government will not proceed with any substantive criminal law reform because of the fear of being wedged on law and order over 12 months out from the election. That is unfortunate. We appear to have politicians from across the political spectrum who no longer see their role in leading public debate and shaping public opinion, but rather only being reflective of what they perceive the majoritarian will to be, even when that perceived will is itself shaped by a 24-hour media cycle and tabloid sensationalism. It seems unthinkable, but Victoria is now the most heavily policed state in Australia. Over the past decade, the introduction of mandatory sentencing, parole and bail reforms has seen our prison population boom. As at June 2021, we had 7,249 prisoners in Victoria, which has expanded more than fourfold since 1980. Each prisoner costs us over $130,000 per annum, and our prison budget is now over $1.6 billion per annum, triple the outlay in 2009 to 2010. We are spending billions of dollars expanding our prison capacity rather than promoting education and rehabilitation, the most durable guarantor of community safety. We have more prisoners being held in remand, entitled to the presumption of innocence, including a disproportionate number of First Nations peoples and women. We have proportionately less prisoners being released with substantive supervision on parole. We have woefully under-resourced transitional accommodation. What's so frustrating about all of this is that we know that prison is criminogenic. It makes us all less safe in the long run. We only need to look to other jurisdictions, such as the United States, to see how this approach is unsustainable, economically and socially. Which brings me to the second point I'd like to make. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Yet our leaders are ignoring the research and the work that has already been done. As an organisation, I think we have a vital role in highlighting and building on the work of others that have come before. For example, it's been 3 decades since the recommendations of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody were published. Yet First Nations peoples are still regularly dying in police custody and are still imprisoned at a grossly disproportionate rate. Then, when there are proposed reforms that could seek to address the systematic disadvantage faced by First Nations peoples and to give First Nations peoples a voice, such as the Uluru Statement from the Heart, there is a willful misrepresentation by some that this would erode parliamentary sovereignty and our democracy. Another lesson from history is the Tampa affair. And we are very fortunate to have with us tonight our speaker, Abbas Nazari, who will discuss his experiences of the Tampa 20 years ago and its aftermath. Together with September 11, 2001, these two events, perhaps more than any others, have shaped the Australian legal and political reality of the 21st century. Both events have been used in different ways to strengthen the executive branch of government and to weaken the oversight of the courts. Both events have been used to diminish fundamental protections under the rule of law. Liberty Victoria's proudest moment was advocating for those on board the Tampa. As a university student, seeing Julian Burnside and Chris Maxwell, with the assistance of Holding Redlich, litigate on behalf of those on board was simply inspiring. It made me want to practice law. There have now been countless reports on the harm caused by indefinite detention, We know it causes immeasurable harm. Many people have died. Countless lives have been ruined. We treat vulnerable people fleeing persecution as a means to the end of general deterrence. When there is a commission into our treatment of people seeking asylum, and it will eventually happen, we cannot say that we didn't know the harm we were causing. And over this period, our government has embraced legal fictions, with Australian waters and then the mainland itself declared not to be Australian territory for the purposes of migration law, all in an endeavour to prevent judicial oversight of executive action. These legal fictions diminish us, they erode our norms, and ultimately they're dangerous. Another example, it's been 6 years since Michael Brett Young's Charter Review in 2015. That provided a valuable roadmap for real and substantive reforms that could strengthen the Charter and improve the human rights of all Victorians. Yet the review appears to be on the shelf, and one would think this is another area of reform unlikely to be pressed before the next state election. A federal charter of rights still seems like a distant dream. Again, like with the Uluru Statement, there is a myth peddled by some in positions of power and some in the media that it would somehow be undemocratic, as though the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa are weakened by having human rights instruments. These are worrying times. We've seen concerning events in the United States with the emergence of the alt-right, which quickly revealed itself as a breeding ground for far-right extremism. We've seen demagogues, and of course we're not immune to this in our corner of the world. We were horrified by the Christchurch mosque shootings. It seems unthinkable, but in recent times we've had groups of white men making Nazi salutes in the Grampians. This is all the more concerning given the loss of the lived history of those who experienced fascism, such as Eddie Jaku, who passed away this year after dedicating his life to informing people about the dangers of the banality of evil. There is a clear link between conspiracy theories, such as QAnon, and the resurgence of the far right. The internet and social media, which have made it easier to find information and to communicate with others than ever before, have paradoxically led to people gravitating to echo chambers and being actively targeted with misinformation. It's in this environment that today we see gallows erected outside Parliament. To me, this all speaks of something deeper. Many people are losing faith in civil society and our institutions, in government and in the media. Some people want this to occur. Liberalism is in crisis. This is unsurprising when many politicians themselves have stopped seeking to lead based on principle and the rule of law, and when short-term political gain, no matter the long-term harm, is now seen as an end in itself. We've seen the politicisation of senior levels of the public service and some tribunals. Again, we only need to look to the United States to see the dangers of a politicised judiciary, where decisions are made with unnerving regularity in accordance with the wishes of the government who appointed the judicial officer. As an organisation, we have a vital role in reaching people, engaging and communicating, and frankly, stopping the rot. That includes reaching people from across the political spectrum. There is no point just preaching to the converted. And despite all the worrying recent events, there is also reason to be hopeful. When we advocate well, we can bring people with us and we can affect real change. I look at the work we've done over the past few years, and there have been many important victories. Our work on LGBTQI+ issues, led in no small part by Jamie, leading to the long overdue expunging of past convictions and to marriage equality. The introduction of spent convictions legislation, championed by Julia and RAP. Defeating measures that would prevent asylum seekers from being restricted from having access to mobile phones in detention, so vital to communicate with loved ones and supporters and to document abuses. Our work lobbying on privacy issues, such as the use or desired use by police of QR code data from COVID-19 applications. And over the past year, we have always had a seat at the table when it came to the COVID-19 response. There's another reason to be hopeful. Perhaps more than ever before in Australia, the COVID-19 pandemic has made people from all walks of life conscious of rights language and rights discourse. Unquestionably, sometimes people are misinformed about the extended protections that we have in Australia for human rights, about how human rights work in practice, and about the harm principle and proportionality. But perhaps more than ever before, we have a community that is considering their lives through the prism of human rights. It's in that context that we have an incredible opportunity as an organisation to contribute to this debate and discourse and to hopefully create real positive change. And I feel very honoured to lead this organisation and to be amongst friends. So thank you for that opportunity. I'd now like to introduce our speaker, Abbas Nazari, and we are very fortunate on this 20th anniversary of the Tampa affair to have someone with lived experience of the Tampa and its aftermath. Abbas was 7 years old and fleeing the Taliban with his family when he was rescued from a sinking boat by the cargo ship, the Tampa. There were 430 people on board, along with Abbas's parents and siblings. He's been afforded the opportunity to live his life now in New Zealand, much to Australia's shame. And he's gone on to battle the odds, from not knowing a word of English to being granted a Fulbright scholarship and studying at Columbia University. And I would urge those that haven't yet had the opportunity to read his book, After the Tampa. It's an incredible chronicle of his experiences. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Abbas Nazari.
Thank you, Michael. That was a fantastic speech before the introduction and the introduction itself. Kia ora, everybody. I am coming to you from Christchurch, New Zealand, in the beautiful South Island of New Zealand. And the reason I say that is that the reason I always begin with that is simple. It's been home for us for the last 20 years. And this city and everything that has come its way over the last 20 years has shaped who I am, has shaped our community, and has shaped my perspective on New Zealand and the wider world. And I'll dig into that a little bit as throughout my address. As Michael mentioned, I was born and raised in Afghanistan. I lived the first 7 years of my life there. I'm going to speak on the assumption that many of you, having worked in the refugee space and the asylum seeker space, are very well aware of the tortured history of my country of birth, the many journeys that people of ethnic and religious minorities face and are forced to take, and the many stories of tragedy and heartache that, you know, kind of symbolize and is the underpinning foundation of so many people's lives. We found ourselves in the middle of the Indian Ocean with no engine, with no forward power, with no real control over our destiny. And the lead up to that point, the lead up and all the decisions along the way that forced us to be on that boat in the Indian Ocean, it was really hard for me to write about for two reasons. It almost seemed as if it was a decision, a decisive command made by my parents, where we had agency and we knew of all the risks and we rolled the dice. But what I found really hard and struggled to write about is that the decision was made for us, you know, to continue to live in Afghanistan under Taliban rule, being an ethnic and religious minority, or to seek shelter and asylum elsewhere. And for us, that meant, you know, the choice was simple. It has been made for us. I mean, I always ask, what would you do in that situation? And then when you're on the shorelines of Jakarta, looking at this wooden fishing boat, the decision again is made for you. You can't go back. You can't stay. The international system that caters for refugees, as many of you know, are poorly inadequate. And so again, you get pulled forward by something that is represents a slight sliver of a hope and a chance. And when we were rescued by the Tampa, when the day after the storm, when the Australian Coast Guard plane had circled overhead, and we thought they might be rescued, and it disappeared. And then it came again in the afternoon, and it finally sent out a Mayday call. And we looked out into the horizon, and we saw this small black dot getting closer and closer and closer until it resembled this giant, great red metal wall that blocked out the horizon. I find it incredibly, incredibly hard to describe that, because it's almost as if you've been drowning and you finally kick up and your head breaks the surface and you take in that first gulp of air. And good old Captain Arnie Rinnan, who, had grown up on the world's oceans, who'd grown up from being a deckhand at the age of 16 to now being captain of this 260-meter behemoth. He knew his obligations, and he knew that his organization, Wilhelmsen Shipping Line, would support him, and he knew his rights and obligations under international law. And he thought that he would be performing which he did. He performed one of the greatest acts of maritime rescue in modern history, and he thought he might be rewarded for it, or at least, someone might shake his hand and say thank you. And lo and behold, what ended up happening is an illustrious chapter in Australian and New Zealand political history. The title of the book is After the Tampa. And the reason we chose that, Alan and Unwin, my publishers, and I chose that was simple. It was such a incredibly potent and divisive issue that so many people actually forget whatever happened to those people that were rescued. What happened to those asylum seekers? What kind of lives are they leading? What are they up to in the last 20 years? So it's after. I do focus on the events of the affair itself and the incredibly painful legacy of offshore detention and all of the legal and political infrastructure that has been built since. Of course, I focus on that and take no prisoners in my view of how that has shaped Australian political society. But the focus is on what happened after. To the 130 odd of us who were granted residency to New Zealand under the Prime Ministership of Helen Clark, it has been a journey of incredible highs and lows. We resettled to Christchurch, New Zealand, after having gone through our six-week orientation program at the Refugee Resettlement Centre here. And I learned my ABCs and would later go on to place third in the New Zealand National Spelling Bee. So it's a little bit that I like writing about. And the other families, like everyone else, like most of you would know, you get given a chance to rebuild a new life, and you just get stuck in. Not knowing the language, not having a financial base, not having an established community, not having anything but, literally like the clothes on your back, which is what we were rescued with by the Tampa. And so those chapters of after the Tampa, of being resettled to New Zealand, of the lives we've been afforded to live, those are my favorite. The Kiwi Dream being the one where I interviewed about 12 others for this book, talking about their experiences of growing up in New Zealand. And the underlying theme that came through in those interviews is one of incredible gratitude to this country. But there were three things that I really took away from all those interviews that I did. When you're a refugee, actually before you become a refugee, when you're living in a land that you have lived on for centuries, for multiple generations, and be it as basic as can be, we lived on a little plot of land, hand-to-mouth subsistence living in the central highlands of Afghanistan. We had three things. We had personal security. We had some dignity in the work that we did in our roles in our community, and we had some agency. It was incredibly tough, but we were able to affect our lives, whether we wanted to work harder or maybe build a new life for ourselves. We had dignity, security, and agency. And then when the country around you collapses and you are no longer wanted, and you just have no place in that country and that piece of land that you've known for generations, you lose those three things. You don't have any security, you're stripped of all your dignity and you're powerless. You have no agency to impact your life, or you have very little of it. And then forced displacement puts you into this rut where you're constantly in search of those three things. And so 6 months after we left our little village, we were resettled to New Zealand. Finally, we were given back those three things. We were afforded back some personal security. We were given some dignity because we were seen as equals, that we had the rights and responsibilities of New Zealand citizenship. And finally, that also allowed us to then pick up some agency, learn the language, pick up our roles in society and all the rest of it that comes with that. And so to boil it down, those are the three things that every human, regardless of your background, requires: some security and some dignity and some agency. And those are the foundations to thrive in any society. And thankfully, we were given that. Many of you who work in the legal sector, many of you who work particularly with immigrants and asylum seekers, you realize that they don't have any of those three. They don't have much security. They're stripped of their dignity. The system does that. And they have no agency, no one to affect their course of the trajectory of their lives, apart from perhaps the folks like yourselves. And so the reason I wrote this book, just to wrap up my talk here, the reason I wrote this book was during the Tampa affair, everything was being said and talked about us without us. We were a bunch of faceless and nameless foreigners held offshore. And we had no way of telling our story. And when I was approached to write this by Alan and Unwin, finally I thought that here's a chance for us to correct the record and tell it from our perspective. It is a story of victimhood, but the underlying foundation of the story is one of resilience and of overcoming tragedy. And that is the key takeaway. That is the key takeaway from this book, that you know, life throws curveballs at you. For us, it was our country collapsing around us. That pain is the gift that everyone receives, but nobody wants. And so that is the underlying message of this book. And it's been the underlying message of all my talks and my messages to folks who would listen. On a final note, I'm sure there have been folks along the way who have, in better positions than I, to have thanked Liberty Victoria for all the work they did during the Tampa affair all those years ago. And I'd like to, I'd like to echo those thanks and those sentiments, because it is folks like yourselves who see something, who see that perhaps there's something wrong here, that want to change. And it might be a long shot, and you might go through the ringer the way folks did back in 2001, but it's worth it, because you leave your mark. Even if you lose, you leave your mark on people and society as a whole. So thank you all for all the work that you do. Sometimes it seems like a bloody thankless job, but you do leave an impression on the folks that you serve. And on another final note, I've just been browsing through your website, and I see, bloke by the name of Muhammad Semra, who's won your, I guess, Young Lawyer of the Year award. And it's incredibly, stories like that, stories of perseverance and resilience and coming on top against all odds. Those are the stories that, need to be celebrated. This city that I'm in right now has seen its fair share of tragedy, with the earthquakes, and then only 2 years ago with the horrific mosque shootings just down the road from where I live. And as Michael pointed out, those elements, those forces, they will always be there. But, it's stories like this, stories like after the Tampa, that help bridge those communities, build bridges between different communities. I'm astounded everywhere I go and talk. People have heard of Afghanistan and they've heard of refugees, but they've never actually spoken to one. They never get to know one personally. And then once you personalize it and see, man, this bloke's not bad after all, then you've built a bridge with that community, and it's incredibly, incredibly powerful. So that the next time you hear or see something about refugees, it's no longer an alien idea. It's personalized. And once that's done, then you start to cut through all of those, the political veneer that polishes all of that. So a wholehearted thank you to you guys for all the work that you did. When I got the request to come and speak at your AGM, I immediately accepted, simply because it was a small way of giving back and maybe putting a face to some of the names, and just a message of encouragement to keep doing what you're doing. I took up law. I did first year law at University of Canterbury. I hated it. I found it incredibly dry. So many of you are laughing because you probably agree, but to those who did continue, thank you, and all the very best. Cheers, Michael.
Thank you so much for that talk, and for sharing your time and experiences with us. If anyone would like to ask a question, please feel free to write it in the chat in the right-hand column, but perhaps I'll kick it off. And I was really interested in your book that, as a New Zealand citizen, now some of your reflections about some of the actions taken by Australia in deporting New Zealand citizens or people with notionally New Zealand citizenship to New Zealand, and that how that's how you share how, in your view, that's further eroding Australia's reputation, compounding our treatment of asylum seekers. And I just want to ask you about your thoughts in relation to, as someone outside of the bubble, and in Australia we perhaps are locked in the bubble, how is Australia perceived internationally and by perhaps civil society groups in places like New Zealand?
It's a really, really good question, Michael, and allow me a couple of minutes to dig into that, because there are so many elements there. Growing up in New Zealand, you always get this notion that Australia and New Zealand are younger and older brothers, but they're incredibly similar to one another. And by and large, that's always true, except the Wallabies having won the Bledisloe for 20 years. All Blacks have been consistently better, but we'll leave that for another day. Over the last few years, what I have seen, though, is I feel like Australia is starting to gravitate and become far more culturally and politically similar to the United States, and far away from the politics and society of New Zealand. And a lot of people had mentioned that, but when I lived in the United States, I lived in Washington for 2 years. I saw that intrinsically on the ground, the same dynamics between the two societies. And that, depending on your point of view, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there are quite a lot of differences. Your point about, Australia deporting essentially Australian citizens who might have been born in New Zealand and left when they were 1 or 2 years old. Those are, by and large, they are Australians, and to deport them when they're 30 and 40 to New Zealand when they've got no home, no family connections or anything, essentially you're offloading your own problems onto another country. I'm always reminded of John Howard's epic line that we will decide who comes to this country and the manner in which they come. That statement kind of sums it all up, because it for me, it asks the question, who is we? Who is it? Who are the people that are making the decisions? We will decide who comes to this country and the manner in which they come. That we is not inclusive. That we is not Australia. It is a certain cohort of Australians who decide who get to be Australian, who don't. That if you're Indigenous, that perhaps you're not in that club. That if you're born in another country, even though you've lived all your life in Australia, that you're not in that club. That if you seek the right to asylum, you'll never be in that club. It's why you have temporary protection visas, which is essentially second-class citizenry. So once you dig in the layers, and by the way, I'm eternally mindful of lecturing Aussies or any other countries about their country, but your question about being outside the bubble, it is interesting. I personally have never stepped foot in Australia apart from transited through Melbourne Airport. So I'm one of those refugees that, that won't use New Zealand as a backdoor to get to Australian citizenship. Although, I've heard talk about that as well. So I don't know what the mood on the ground is, but I understand that when it comes to talking about refugees or asylum seekers or even bloody hell climate change, the argument, the debate, you know, it really dissipates and devolves into something akin to what you might see in America. Whereas here, it's a bit more civilized and substantive discussion can happen. So my final 30 seconds on that is, I feel that the needle hasn't moved much at all in the last 20 years with regards to asylum seekers. If anything, it's probably gone backwards. And that has kind of continually eroded Australia's reputation from a New Zealand perspective. The differences are much more obvious with the current administration in both countries, Ardern and Morrison, with so many stances on security, on climate change, on the pandemic, and, you know, with regards to immigration as well. So it's interesting because, you know, when Australia, for example, when Australia puts its foot down, it expects New Zealand to just kind of go toe to toe there and you know, walk in step. But that used to be the case. It's no longer. And New Zealand is confidently, I guess, just saying we don't have to follow Australia's lead because the differences are quite obvious. That's my understanding of it.
Thank you. Bas Michelle asks, do you have any suggestions as to how to speak to those who have fear or distrust that helps them be even slightly more open to a new way to think about a place for refugees in Australia?
You know, in New Zealand, I think people are, when it comes to refugees, when it comes to immigrants, there is, I wouldn't say it's easier, but there is a place, or at least the majority of folks in this country accept that everyone in this country are immigrants. That is embedded in the notion that even the indigenous people of this country arrived 1,000 years ago on a boat, and that since then immigrants have arrived on boats to New Zealand, that we are all a nation of immigrants. And so inherently, the conversation about immigration is a little bit easier in this country than it is perhaps in Australia, where with that country's history of immigration, it's a bit more layered. And so immigration in New Zealand is altogether talked about differently. So I can't speak about Australia, but what I can give is that the moment you humanize it, the moment it just becomes a bit more easier to talk about. So people want to know about what happened in the Tampa affair. They don't want to know about the politics or the legalities or anything like that. They want to know about what happened on the people. What are they up to now? And so that's why I think this story is starting to resonate. And that's why I think I'm starting to see, just through Twitter and a few other places, that there is a push for celebrating different stories and different perspectives in all levels of Australian society, whether it be politics, business, sports. And that's, I think, a step in the right direction. So my one hesitation with that is, you know, as well as seeing, I guess, a diversity of color, I'd also like to see a huge diversity of opinion as well, because I know, you know, even in the Afghan community here in New Zealand, there's a huge difference in opinion politically and socially and all the rest of it. And by and large, that's good because it creates richness. You know, you don't want every refugee or every brown person on TV to be aligned one way or the other politically, because that in turn ends up being even more polarizing in the end. I guess thinking about Australia, it's a much bigger country, and there are pockets. I mean, most of you guys are based in Melbourne, and I've seen that COVID-19 has led to quite some, you know, pretty raw and pretty open divisions in society. And so I wonder whether even some place as liberal as Melbourne will be able to recover, and what the conversations regarding immigration would look like in the coming future.
Thanks for that. I just wanted to take up a part of Spencer's question. I think you've already expressed some of your views about Australia and how it's perceived. But in relation to resilience, I mean, how do you, going through your experiences and starting a new life in New Zealand and going through what you went through as a child, and how do you deal with issues of despondency or anger, or how do you have resilience?
Resilience is, I first heard of the word following the 2011 Canterbury earthquakes, when 100 and odd, 80 odd people were taken away from us, and everyone kept talking about Canterbury and Christchurch being a very resilient city, and I never really understood it until we had 20,000 aftershocks over the course of 2 years, and we just every time it rolled through, just get back up, and we'd have cracks in our ceilings and all the rest of it, and come through again, we'll paint over it, and I realized the meaning of resilience, about getting back up every time you get knocked down. And this city has a special place for that, especially in the last couple of years as well. On a personal level, going through something that we did, like what we went through, it gives you an enormous sense of perspective on not just yourself, but on life. Because we had been so close to death, because we had been so desperate, and we'd been on an endless journey for so long, that when we were finally given a chance at resettlement and asylum in New Zealand, we understood what we had gone through. And so we just embraced everything with open arms, and by and large, that has placed us in really good stead. Now, I'm not saying that everyone has to go through what we went through to get a sense of perspective and realize how lucky they are, but it does help when you kind of step back and say, what I'm going through, this particular challenge right ahead of me, it's not that bad because I have gone through worse. That also allows us to look at things from multiple perspectives. It's very hard nowadays when we're all wrapped up in our own little echo chambers, and people always giving us the kind of instant gratification. It's very hard to step outside and look at a situation, be it business, social, relations, all the rest of it, from a different perspective. But once you build that, it does make you into a stronger character. So resilience for me, I feel like nowadays, I look at my younger brothers, they're only 10 years younger than me. A lot of kids nowadays are growing up without resilience, where they get knocked down very, very easily, and they don't quite know how to get back up. So through some work that I'm doing next year, I'd like to work with refugee and immigrant background kids to kind of help them navigate their identities and the challenges that they face, and maybe come back stronger for it. Finally, I was incredibly fortunate to have gone through that journey at quite a young age. I was only 7 or 8 by the time I got to New Zealand. And so while I remember it, remember it vividly and have memories of our journey, what I lack is perhaps some of the context and understanding of why we went through what we went through. And that has in turn shielded me from some of the mental and emotional trauma that many other refugees might go through. So the silver lining to it is that while I remember it, while I have memories, I don't have nightmares. And thankfully, that is something that has placed me in good stead, because I know others who still find it incredibly hard to wrap their heads around some of the stuff that they have witnessed or endured. So to wrap that up, it's essentially, if there's one silver lining about the entire refugee experience, it is that it gives you a great sense of perspective, and then therefore makes you a bit more resilient. I think the key takeaway is that you can either view yourself as a victim, which we could easily have done. But my dad, who installed some of the values in me, he said, look, you can always claim victimhood and claim that mantle, and it's all rightfully yours. Or you could just kind of look at what's coming ahead of you and grab it with both hands, this opportunity, and don't see being a refugee as something that drags you down, but as a source of strength. And that has taken me years to shake my head around. And now I proudly, claim the refugee, label. I used to disown it because I thought, I don't want to be associated with that. But now it's an enormous part of my identity.